Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. Today, we are welcoming to the podcast Professor Alejandro Velasco, who is a professor of history at NYU, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
That's right.
And we want to talk about Venezuela. Professor Velasco is an expert in the fields, published many, pieces of scholarship and writing about this. But I first have to apologize. My voice may sound a little bit weird because I've been sick for a month straight.
No. He's the parent of a toddler, so,
Yeah, I understand that.
That's how these things tend to happen. Spend your whole entire holiday break off work just getting sick over and over again.
The revolving door of germs.
Yeah, but that's, the Gnostic Demiurge SD Creed. That's how we shall live. But so anyway, to kick things off, Alejandro, I thought we could just give a sort of state of play of what's happened. We saw the bare strokes of it, the basic narrative. Commandos went in, with the FBI, right? And they nabbed Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, took him to Manhattan, where he's now on trial for something. That part is kind of unclear.
What weapon possession, I think, is the
machine guns.
Yeah.
Remember, if you have machine guns in the United States, you may go to jail.
Yeah. I mean, it's like you can't do that. You're a leader of a country. Not unless you're headed to your workplace massacre. You're not allowed to have.
That's right. Exactly. No, for sure.
Machine guns. But anyway, do we? Oh, and then now, so the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, is de facto in charge of Venezuela now. That's pretty much the narrative. The story as I understood it, at the beginning of the week. Do we know anything more than that?
Well, we should say that Delcy Rodriguez is not de facto president. She is de jure president. She was sworn into the presidency after the Supreme Court ruled that Nicolas Maduro was kidnapped and is unlikely to return, and therefore cleared the way for her to be sworn in, which happened at the same time as the National Assembly for this legislative period was also sworn in. And the reason why that's significant, and hopefully not too much in the weeds for your listeners, is because the National Assembly now includes some opposition members. And so part of the question was, will the opposition members that were elected to be in the National Assembly, will they show up? And they did. And so the significance there is that it highlights a rift in the broader opposition world between those in the expatriate opposition, putatively led by Maria Corina Machado, and then those who are waging opposition domestically. So that's one thing that happened. Another thing that happened last night, you may have been alerted to this, but there was intense gunfire and anti-aircraft munitions being detonated outside of the Miraflores presidential palace, which of course created massive amounts of speculation and fear. And you can see videos of this online. And at least for now, the reporting is that one of the many security forces in Venezuela was piloting a drone and didn't alert the other security forces near the presidential palace that they would be doing that. And then, there was this assumption that it might have been another, incursion. So that was, but it also, of course, highlights just a tremendous amount of anxiety currently in play. And then the other thing that happened today is that we are receiving reports that several oil tankers have departed from United States ports to Venezuela. Two of them are headed to ports in Venezuela. The other four, not ports, all of them are headed to ports in Venezuela, but two of them are headed to ports controlled by the government. And four of them, I suppose, are headed to ports controlled by Chevron. And then, of course, we have this tweet from Donald Trump saying that Venezuela, the interim authorities have said that 30 to 50 million barrels of oil are going directly to the United States to be sold and controlled by Donald Trump exclusively to then be, the revenues of which would then be used to benefit the people in the US and the people in Venezuela, which, is there cursing on the show? I don't know if there's cursing on the show.
No, when appropriate. Yeah, it's
who the fuck knows what that means, right? So that's sort of the current state of play.
And we should also add probably because we could get into speculation soon enough, but in the press conference, the rambling press conference that Trump gave, he was asked what he meant by we will be running Venezuela. And they asked, well, who? When you say we, who and how? And he said, well, the guys behind me will be doing it.
That's right.
And then at a different point, he tried to say, well, actually, it's somehow the military will be protecting the oil and that will be leverage. And also we could do a second strike. So then he kind of intimated that what it means to run is really to threaten another invasion.
Right. I mean, there's a couple of things that I think are really extraordinary about that whole series of comments and then what they might or might not mean in the days since. The first is that you kind of read it as a very crass but deadly version of 21st century gunboat diplomacy. And interestingly, of course, gunboat diplomacy goes all the way back to the later, late 19th century, early 20th century, also in Latin America, where you position gunboats right off the coast of a country in order to extract certain concessions, right? That's the entire premise. And so what is this massive armada right off the coast of Venezuela if not a coercive tactic to get the government to do what the United States wants? Yet at the same time, part of, I think, that the challenge here in terms of thinking about this strange kind of regime change that may or may not have happened, where the entire regime apparatus remains exactly as is, but the only thing that's missing is the person on top, is that it's unclear to what extent actually the threat of further intervention will go. Not to suggest that there may not be other attacks, assaults, etc., but that the kind of version of regime change that they seem to be signaling or rehearsing in this particular case, it's really quite novel. And it's unclear whether or not it will work. Because suppose that Delcy Rodriguez and the government are doing the things that Trump and the administration want vis-a-vis oil. But say down the road, they say, well, now we want you to hold elections. And Delcy says, no. And will that mean that they will then go in and take Delcy? Maybe, but the next person will say no. And then will they just keep doing this? And then what does that mean? So, at what point does this kind of, well, we'll just swap in whoever does what we want them to do, stand in for actually a regime change that's more conventional, which would be, troops on the ground. So it does seem to me that what the government in Venezuela now is probably understanding is that they do have a little bit of leverage, and the leverage that they have is it's unlikely that the Trump administration will commit an actual ground presence of U.S. troops and personnel, and as a result, they will do things that they were probably going to do anyway. They may even do some things that they didn't want to do anyways, but they also feel like they may not have to do everything that the Trump administration wants them to do.
Yeah,
that's a great point. I think it has to be a bluff in a way, because that reminds me we should add something about the success of the kidnapping, if you will, from Trump's perspective. It killed a number of Venezuelans and other non-Americans. We could talk about what the numbers might be for that, but apparently no American soldiers were killed. And if he wants to keep that the way that it works, we think that there must have likely been some cooperation, hence / betrayal, in order to facilitate that going so smoothly. And to your point, this kind of like turtles all the way down thing, if you want to keep doing this, at some point you're no longer going to have the cooperation and you're going to have to actually sacrifice Americans, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, this is just my own thinking, just reading the the various incentives and constraints of players, at the geopolitical level involved. Obviously, and I'm finishing up an op-ed that hopefully will come out tomorrow in the Guardian about this, but the U.S. has, of course, overwhelming force, covert and conventional, to be able to deploy against a country like Venezuela. On the other hand, what we saw yesterday, again, in the context of this confused, anxious state of a drone from friendly unit being shot at with small arms fires and some anti-aircraft, like there were multiple low-level, slow-flying, large helicopters over the valley of Caracas. Like some soldier with an AK-47 could have taken some shots. Somebody with a bazooka might have just launched over the course of 2 hours or something. The fact that there was none of that, and you're speaking to the casualties, the ones that we know of are all part of the direct security detail of Maduro, not actually part of the military writ large, right? So you have to speculate, but you don't have to speculate too much, especially given the seamlessness of the post-Maduro transition in Venezuela, and also knowing the prior reporting that it suggested that the only sticking point for negotiations that had been happening prior to, the assault was whether Maduro would stay or go. Like they had given basically all of the oil concessions that Trump wanted. And so the only sticking point was Maduro. And then suddenly this happens in this very kind of seamless way that, as we saw in the cameras, you have to, I think, but you have to entertain the point that at some point his inner circle said, okay, well, fine. The way that we stay in power is by giving up this person, and we will stand down. This thing will happen. You will have your prize. You can say that you showed something for the massive military presence. Yes, of course, we will continue to have this armada as a kind of Damocles sword over our head, but only to a point. And that's to your point. Like, at what point does that become untenable as well?
Yeah, that was I was just about to ask about that, because it does strike. I mean, it seems that either there was some sort of conspiracy, or they just got world historically lucky. And the bluster about being able to do this on cue to anybody strikes me as extremely unlikely. That if an attack like this succeeds, much like the Ukrainian attack or the very novel drone attack against the Russian strategic bomber fleet, like that's the kind of thing you really only do once, maybe twice, before people learn. They take countermeasures. Right. I think the last thing that Trump wants is like 50 dead American soldiers involved in some sort of like decapitation strike against like Cuba or something like that. That would be very bad for him politically, I think. Can you talk a little bit more about the background here? Because as a total non-expert here, it always struck me that like Maduro's rule, he was kind of like the worst parts of Hugo Chavez and none of the good parts. Like Hugo Chavez had the luck to be like presiding at a time of like pretty high oil prices for the most part, had lots of money to play with. The oil infrastructure was functioning pretty well. And he used a lot of that money was disappeared into corruption, but a lot of it went into social welfare programs, a lot of education programs. Come 2014, here comes the fracking boom. The price of oil goes down, and meanwhile, Maduro just basically, instead of taking like some of the money, is taking like all the money. You have like hyperinflation and just like economic collapse. But that's sort of, I don't know, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but is this part of why maybe some insiders are like, we need to get rid of this guy. He doesn't know what the hell he's doing, or threatening the stability of the regime this is classic like French Revolution stuff. Like you need a sort of modicum of production and prosperity to keep your dictatorship afloat, right? So, you think that played a part?
Well, firstly, for somebody who doesn't follow it closely, that was pretty spot on in terms of a summary. So kudos to you. I think there was this kind of, I don't know what the exact term would be, but this inverse relationship in terms of power, repression, and during the Maduro government, where the less access to oil wealth as the result of not only the declining prices beginning in 2014, but also just the massive amounts of spending that had been done under Chavez before, and the accumulated debts, et cetera, which is just a very classic petrostate, paradox of plenty story. The more, in order to stay in power, you need to resort to, number one, pay off the military, which of course controls the guns, and therefore, unlike Chavez, who comes from the military and already had that kind of support, Maduro had to purchase it. But then the more you resort to repression in order to stay in power, the greater the costs of exit, right? And so, as those exit costs rise, then you have to continue to entrench yourself in power at all costs, right? And so that's part of the, perverse dynamic that we began to see right around 2015, 2016 in Venezuela, which leads to, Maduro having a very, low popularity. But then to your other point, what it also does is it, creates, a lightning rod, right? All attention is focused on this one person. And not that I would give credit to the Trump administration for doing this. I don't know that they would be concerted or smart enough to make this happen. But part of the narrative over the last 6 months around Venezuela and specifically Maduro was Maduro himself. Like, he is the head of this massive multinational criminal conspiracy, not even conspiracy, criminal cartel, which now the DOJ has said, oh, actually, no, we weren't serious about that. It's just like what everyone else was saying, but don't worry. And everything seemed to be moving towards centering attention on Maduro, such that, again, at some point, there would be a tipping point to say, like, wow, okay, if you guys get Maduro, then you get your guy. And then the rest of the apparatus remains as is. So yes, part of that story is to what extent Maduro represents a continuity of Chavismo, and to what extent does it represent something entirely different? And the reality is that there were always authoritarian currents in Chavismo, but those currents were held in balance for many years by other democratizing, participatory, and eventually socialist currents. And the kind of balance of these two were held by the political acumen as well as the charisma of Hugo Chavez, neither of which Maduro turned out to have. And so as a result, you get as exactly as you well put it, you get only the authoritarianism when none of the participatory socialist components of Chavismo.
Can you say more about how other constraints like U.S. sanctions or things that people might not necessarily, because in a vacuum, we just think, oh, someone can choose to be authoritarian and repressive. And you've already said the inverse relationship there between the need for repression in lieu of, prosperity and so forth. But are there other factors that relate to maybe U.S. foreign policy or other things that and maybe Guyana could be brought into the discussion at some point, other things that Americans might not be aware of that we should think about that factor into how Venezuela has been run?
Yeah. I mean, the question of sanctions, of course, is front and center. And as you might both know, and also not be surprised by, a huge subject of debate. And there's loads of economists on different sides crunching many, many numbers to figure out like what actually is the impact of sanctions, and is it all about sanctions or is it all about mismanagement and corruption? And the reality is that clearly it's both. We had already begun to see a decline in the economy before the collapse of oil prices. We had also begun to see the kind of untenable and very classic, as I mentioned before, structural patterns of boom and bust cycles manifesting with the overexpenditure, even in times of plenty. The additional factor that complicated for Chavismo this otherwise conventional boom and bust petrostate dynamic is, and I've written about this elsewhere, that Chavez in particular, but Chavismo as a movement, especially after Chavez's death, in really profound and important ways, was a victim of its own political successes. And what I mean by that is that its ability not only to survive, but really to thrive in the wake of massive opposition, missteps, mistakes, stupidity between 2001 and 2013, all of that contrived to create, by many different ways, complete control over the state. So the coup in 2002 gave Chavez complete control over the military because he was able to pinpoint like who's with me, who's not, right? And so they were able to purge the military. The oil industry strike in 2002, 2003 allowed Chavez to purge PDVSA from, of dissidents and then stack it with loyalists. The recall referendum in 2004 gave Chavez massive amounts of international legitimacy when the opposition claimed fraud without being able to prove it. But that claiming of fraud then led to boycotting of parliamentary elections in 2005, which then gave Chavez control over the legislature, with which then he was able to pack the courts, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that meant that Chavez, at the time when there's most amount of money, I mean, the amounts of money coming into Venezuela between 2006 and 2012 were difficult to calculate. There's so much money. Complete control with zero accountability. That is sort of the detonating factor for corruption, which does two things. It simultaneously allows this very robust state spending to happen for the benefit of social sectors that have been left out. But it also is enough to mask massive amounts of corruption. So you can have both things. You can have growth, development, and massive amounts of corruption happening simultaneously. The problem, of course, is when that money dwindles and you have to choose between spending for social purposes and fueling a corruption that helps me stay afloat as a government. You're likely to choose the latter. And so, that's part of the story here. What sanctions do in 2017 is they strangle far further not only access to petrodollars, which then, of course, already had been in the process of declining and therefore sapping what was left of the state apparatus in terms of social spending, but it also creates its own kind of logic of, as other people have written about, patrimonialism, where the entire purpose of the state is for people to essentially, take as much from it as possible. And so therefore you have access to it. And if you have access to it, either as a tiny minor bureaucrat who can charge for a form or a transaction, all the way up to a general that exacts, quota for, shipping off some, product to Turkey or skimming off the top, et cetera, like that becomes very generalized. So the incentives for corruption are fueled by sanctions, which then, of course, have this spillover effect on the population. Now, you could say, the Maduro government didn't have to make the choices that it did in the context of sanctions. It could have tried to stem corruption. And instead devote some of the revenue to social spending. It did not do that. But the other major thing that it didn't do was curb an inflationary spiral. Instead, it decided to print cash to try to distribute liquidity in the population through all sorts of programs and mechanisms. But of course, injecting cash with no backing is what detonates hyperinflation, right? So all these things are in play.
It occurs to me that Trump aspires to part of your narrative there, which is to have no accountability and use all the prosperity of this country to do whatever he wants. He definitely seems to have a patrimonial vision of the state. The state is at the disposal of those who have access to it, right? And if I am at the top, I will make as much use of it. Absolutely. Yeah.
No, this ties neatly into what I wanted to talk about next, which is oil. And what you were just saying, and the tweet that Trump put up on Truth Social, like just as we were doing the prep for this episode, like literally like an hour ago, that he's got 30 to 50 million barrels of oil at his own personal disposal, supposedly. I think it brings into focus exactly what's happening here, because you'll see there's like a real common narrative going back years, but like about the war in Iraq was that like this is all about oil. This is like a sort of capitalist. The logic of capital extending itself. And if you look at, like I wrote a piece today, you look at the logic of capital, the logic of the oil industry right now, the idea of like going into Venezuela and spending what, one expert estimated would be $100 billion to get its like rotting infrastructure modernized and repaired so that you can produce more oil is not really good for the American oil industry. Like, unlike back in the early 2000s, America is a major oil and gas producer. They're the biggest in the world. We produce more than Russia, more than Saudi Arabia. Right now, the price of oil is already quite low. It's $56 a barrel when I checked just a minute ago. That's already below what a lot of, the common consideration of break-even point for fracking, which is $60 a barrel. And so if the idea that you're going to go in, Venezuela, I think is producing about 1 million barrels. It has been producing about a million barrels a day, right? And right. It used to produce about 3 million. So, prices are set on the margin. So another couple odd million barrels a day, like the U.S. oil industry as a whole doesn't want that. But what individual people might want, some of whom are associated with the oil industry or own parts of the oil industry might want, they could see them a way to make a quick profit for themselves, in just the way that Maduro and all of his cronies used the state for their own personal benefit at the expense of its broader prosperity generation capacity. I think that's what's happening right here. You have Trump seizing the opportunity to make, it's like a 1.7 to $2.8 billion right there, and just straight up slush money fund for himself, that with no accountability. That's what's, it's not about ExxonMobil. It's about Trump, and it's about his, associates. Paul Singer, who bought up the corpse of Citgo, the Venezuelan gas company, gas station company for
former Venezuelan,
that was worthless because of sanctions. And now that's coming up. And did he have inside information about that? He might have. Right. But you see how it worked out in Venezuela, that eventually the oil industry itself was wrecked because of too much of this kind of stuff. They destroyed their ability to produce.
That's such a good point, because there's two things that come to mind. The first is extreme irony, which is that so much of the critique and criticism around Chavez was exactly about the funneling of the oil wealth directly to the executive branch to then distribute to the population through social missions, through social programs that were controlled through the executive branch, right? And this is nothing if not that. But of course, I doubt that we'll get a lot of social programs out of it. So, maybe we'll have to trump that particular analogy. But the other part of it too is, and this is a little bit more serious, which is, yes, of course, you're exactly right. Economically, it does not seem to make sense to think about this only as conflict over oil. It's not right now profitable. Who knows if it would be if prices rise? You mentioned the break-even point of fracking, which is, I think, when people think about oil in Venezuela, they have the images primarily of the lake, the Maracaibo Lake, basin with the conventional dairy, and whatnot. But really, most of the oil that is in the subsoil is in the Orinoco River basin, and that's fracked oil, right? So really, fracking is the primary operation. It's the reason why Chevron remains in Venezuela. It's also the reason why ConocoPhillips and Exxon did not agree to the terms of the renationalization in 2007 that Chavez was pushing forward, because they saw at the time how profitable fracking would be, and they didn't want to give that up. But I think this is much larger than oil, and I think it's much larger than the control over Venezuela's oil resources. I don't know if this is Trump's particular vision, but it certainly seems to be the vision of others around him, Marco Rubio, Stephen Miller, and others, which is control over all natural resources in the hemisphere, right? Oil right now is at the center stage, but Venezuela is rich in other resources, as are other parts of, the region: copper, lithium, cobalt, et cetera, et cetera. And part of the statements justifying this more broadly from the Trump administration have been this reassertion of, as he's calling it, this Donroe Doctrine, which is really all about call it manifest ownership of the continent for the purposes of the greatness of the United States, right? Miller said this just yesterday in an interview with, I think it was CBS or one of those networks. He said, no one in the hemisphere should be giving resources to anyone in the hemisphere but the United States. We want it, and we just give it to us. Sure, we'll pay you for it, but it's ours. And why would you be sending oil to China? Why would you be sending oil to Europe? We're here, right? And so I think you're right that the economics of this don't really make sense, but they may make a little bit more sense if we think about it more in terms of this larger continental hemispheric strategy for asserting a kind of de facto ownership over the continent and its subsoil.
Yeah,
and there does seem to be, because there was also recent news, another tweets and reports around Greenland again. Greenland's back in the news. More serious reports this time that maybe toddler Trump has seen how fun it is to overtake a sovereign nation and also do a land grab, and maybe he can keep doing this bloodless, at least on the American side, takeover again and again, by showing it's kind of like, if you don't want to happen to you, what I've done over here, you better, also acquiesce. And as irrational as Trump might be, I could see him thinking that, and thinking, hey, let's just run this play over and over again.
I learned something today. I have to do some research into it. I'm not an expert in Greenland, but apparently from Cold War era, there were some treaties signed between the United States and NATO and others, saying that actually, if conditions fit, we will take over. The United States has rights to Greenland. But what's interesting about that, even if it's true, and again, I don't want to suggest that I know that it is true, is that they're not making that argument. They're making an argument of force. They're making an argument of might. They're making an argument of inherent right. And so again, that suggests that even when you might have a path of very least resistance, if it doesn't fit within this larger worldview of hemispheric supremacy and domination, then that's not the path that we want, right? To your point.
This is interesting. I think it might be worth talking about, because one of the fascinating things of that crazy press conference to me was this kind of transparency, right, about the imperialism and the might makes right and everything, because the lead up for months, and also still peppered into the press conference, were other narratives about drugs, about democracy, about we're helping the people of Venezuela, look at the people celebrating in the streets. So maybe this is a time to debunk certain things. Like, it's not about drugs. It was never about drugs. It's not about democracy. It's not about liberating or helping the people of Venezuela. So maybe you could talk about and obviously we didn't say this to the outset because I think our audience knows this, but this was obviously illegal both by international and U.S. law, right? So maybe we could just do a quick debunking of certain narratives that the Trump administration has put through, which strangely they've done at times in conjunction with this more transparent narrative.
No, you're totally right. And there is something weirdly refreshing about not having to go through subterfuge or conspiracy theorizing. If it's so transparent, you don't have to convince anybody. Of course, it's about the oil. Well, they said it. It's a little bit like when I teach about Guatemala in 1954 to my students on revolutions and counter-revolutions in Latin America, and then they read the CIA PB success document where it outlines step by step how they orchestrated a coup against Jacobo Arbenz. And students are like, wait a minute, why would they say this so directly? And it's like they're doing the work for you. And to now hear it directly from the president of the United States, it is quite astonishing for, I think, many of us who've been trained to read subtext. What happens when it's not subtext, but it is so blatantly text? In fact, some of the reactions that I've seen, especially around neocons, have been like, no, he didn't mean that. He meant this other thing. He's like redirecting back towards a subtext that's not actually the thing itself. But to your point, yes, over the last 6 months, what we had been hearing from the Trump administration was a series of rehearsals for an outcome that they wanted. And the question about what the intent of those rehearsals was about was, I think, in part to see what appetite there might be among the MAGA base, among people in Congress, for the various justifications that they were rehearsing. But the outcome, I think, was decided. The question was, how do we get to where we want to get? So we start with Venezuela is opening up its jails and sending all these criminals across the border to sow mayhem in the United States. Zero evidence of that. Extremely critical human rights organizations even had to come out and say, like, well, we hate the Maduro government, but there's no truth to these claims. Then it was a question of him leading this, multinational drug cartel, Cartel de los Soles, through which then, you had these tentacles all throughout the hemisphere. And of course, that also is not true. Venezuela does export drugs, but primarily to Europe, not to the United States. And it exports zero fentanyl. Right? All of that comes from China and through Mexico. Then it became the issue of, okay, it's not just like a kind of phantom cartel that's webbed together in these various ways. It's about these boats. And that's why we have to take out these boats. And each boat saves 50,000 lives. Zero evidence of any of that, of course. And of course, there's zero evidence that any of these boats actually carry any drugs. And even if they did, right, there are things like international law. And even domestic law would say that you cannot just summarily execute somebody on the presumption of having committed a crime, right? So these become extrajudicial killings, which I think then becomes a problem for the Trump administration as Congress. Even those in the Republican Party, people like Rand Paul and others, start asking questions based precisely on what is self-evident, right? And they just start pulling a little bit at the thread of falsity around these narratives. And then at that point is when you begin shifting to other interests. You talk a little bit about democracy after Maria Corina Machado wins her Nobel Prize, but that never really took so much. And I think it's just because Trump literally could not care less. And so, as much as others might have tried to make that into a trial balloon, that was never going to be something that they were going to sell Trump on. But then he finally used the O word, right? It was about 4 weeks ago when he first said, actually the thing here is oil. They have our oil. They stole our oil. The oil is ours. And that's an interesting, thing to have landed on, not only because, of course, it, as you well said, makes so transparent and textual things that otherwise might be subtextual, but because you wonder to what extent that could, in fact, be something that might have played with a MAGA base that has a direct kind of pocketbook issue around the price of gasoline, right? And so you can sell the idea that, hey, yeah, oil prices or gas prices are not too high right now, but they could be even lower. Remember the days when they were less than $2 a gallon? We can get back to that. Obviously, there's no direct correlation that would lead us there, not only in the medium term, the long term, but that might be something that sells in addition to then advancing this other agenda that we've been talking about.
It occurs to me too, there's a paternalism there because some of the language was like, they don't know how to use their oil. We know how to do it. Like our companies, we're the people that know how to maximize profit in this industry. Like we'll show them how it's done and it'll benefit the people of Venezuela too. Like there's a kind of like that arrogant business side of Trump that came out there a little bit too.
No, for sure. I mean, what's interesting about that too is part of what I've been trying to tease out is not only how these various narratives may or may not have played in the MAGA base, but how they may or may not have played among the opposition in Venezuela, which have already been making for years now this kind of devil's bargain with Trump. Not so much a devil's bargain. I do think that, for instance, Maria Corina Machado truly ideologically believes in a kind of very privatizing model of economic growth. But I did see, although the weekend, I think, unfortunately popped some of my enthusiasm. I did see the moment when Trump first started talking about oil exactly in the terms that you're describing. They wrecked the industry. They didn't know how to handle it. We are the only ones that are able to manage it, et cetera. A real wounded sense of pride, even among those in the opposition who for years have been saying, like, no, we, after the oil nationalization in 1976, we built PDVSA into a world-class oil company. What are you talking about? Are you saying that we were not able to run PDVSA when it was on par with, Exxon and Mobil and whatever else have you, right? And so there was this real wounded sense of pride that for a moment seemed to strangely generate one of the very few issues that cut across some of the deep polarization, political polarization in Venezuela, not just around the issue of like the oil is ours, but also, no, we can manage it. It just needs to be rightly managed. And so that was part of it. Of course, I think what I meant about the weekend is that many expressions of support, not just for the ouster of Maduro, but also for the armed intervention by the United States, which has created this other rift in terms of opposition politics between those who support direct intervention by a foreign country, and then those, of course, in the opposition, but who have to bear the brunt of potential bombs and missiles while being in Venezuela.
Oh, is that the division, do you think, between expats it's easy for some expats to be okay with the foreign intervention, where those on the ground, even if they're in opposition, and maybe this explains some of the unity in that you mentioned early on about installing Rodriguez as the de jure president. Is that part of that kind of split there on the opposition? Who has to actually suffer the reality domestically?
Yeah, absolutely. The center of gravity of opposition politics shifted from Venezuela itself, from the domestic sphere, to outside Venezuela around 2018, right? And at first it was the issue of the sectoral sanctions and the dramatic effect of those sanctions, as we talked about earlier. And that really put the domestic opposition, which at the time had been ascendant, in a really difficult spot of having to decide to say, look, we do not support these generalized sanctions for the purposes of generating, misery that might eventually, even though it's never, the literature on sanctions is almost univocal in saying that they do not work, that they're primarily for U.S. domestic audiences or domestic audiences of nations that impose sanctions, and that their impact on the population as a whole amounts to collective punishment. And so they were put in this position of having to distance themselves from the Trump administration's policies, while at the same time accepting, that it had been primarily being pushed by this expatriate opposition. And that's when we began to see that split. It cements in 2018, and then in 2019, early in 2019, it really manifests with Juan Guaido becoming this interim president, or declaring himself, interim president after what they had claimed was fraudulent presidential elections in 2018. When that happens, when the sphere of influence, the center of gravity of opposition politics shifts to abroad rather than domestically, the incentive structure for opposition politics shifts as well. Then it becomes more about enacting maximum punishment, maximum pain in order to engineer, in order to extract a reaction that then will, have the regime topple. The problem with that, aside, of course, from the obvious, human rights, ethical and moral implications, is that it's based on a faulty assumption that the government is weak. It's not. It's never been weak. It's chaotic, it's in disarray, it relies on corruption, but it's not weak, right? It's not the absence of a state that's the problem in Venezuela. It's the abundance of a very badly, corruptly run state, which is a very different thing. And so the theory of change of the opposition has long been the government is weak. It just needs a little push and it's going to collapse. And again and again and again and again and again and again and again. I cannot say that word strongly and repeatedly enough. It never comes true. And so, at this point, it feels almost, I don't know, pathological, this sort of magical realism around a Chavista, Madurista state that is so far from the reality of what they imagine, and therefore induces so many bad choices when it comes to political and especially geopolitical action.
And yet none of that geopolitical acumen, I think, explains why the Trump administration didn't go the traditional route of, regime change that they make it seem like was organic and that the CIA actually did from within, and installing the more right-wing opposition party domestically and just pretending we had nothing to do with it. That wouldn't be something he would be reluctant to do, I think. What do you think the reason for this deviation from previous ways that the U.S. has messed with other people's sovereignty? What do you think explains it?
Well, I think in part it's what Brian was talking about before, right? That the optics of troops on the ground who then get killed, even if it's 2, 3, or 20, would be, disastrous politically for Trump here. And so I think what he wanted was, what is the least amount of commitment that we can make to engineer a change that we want. But as we were talking about before, if that is the case, and Venezuela and the Venezuelan government knows that is the case, then that actually gives them some room to maneuver. Where I think that the projection on the part of Trump and maybe on the part of Rubio is like, we're pulling their chain, we yank it and they come back, we release it and they go, but it's not quite that way. They do, of course, have tremendous amounts of both formal and informal leverage to exact upon the Venezuelan government, but it's not limitless, and that's important.
I guess I meant more like funding a civil war and having covert boots that we could deny are there, kind of thing.
I'm sorry, I thought you meant. We apparently there's CIA right now roaming around Venezuela, so there is.
I'm sure.
Yeah. But to your point, yes, there could have been a kind of let's try to sow some chaos. Frankly, I think that the Venezuelan state is really very, very effective in repressing dissent and has no compunction and has shown no compunction about doing so. So even if it tried to fund, say, contra like insurgency, number one, I think it would be hard to find people to do it, and you'd have to spend a lot of money, which obviously the U.S. can. But again, it's sort of thinking about the path of least resistance. That seems like a lot of investment. You have to find the people.
Now that does sound like Trump.
Yeah, right. You have to train them, and you don't know they're going to be effective, and they're going to complain. And, can we do this just on our own without having to rely on anybody else? And so, but again, I do think that the Venezuelan state is extremely effective at repressing dissent wherever it comes from. And so I think that too might have proven a much higher risk strategy for them.
I've got just one more question for me, and I wanted to bring it back to the subject of oil a little bit, because one of the aspects of it that I find so backwards about, the focus on oil is the fact that, we're looking down the barrel of just like the long-term collapse of the oil industry. Last year, 25% of all cars sold in the world were EVs. More than half of all the cars sold in China were EVs. It's already taken a bite of maybe, 1-2 million barrels of oil a day of demand out. And, you look at like China, the sort of, cutting edge technological leader of the world, like they are just going all in, massive investments in renewable energy, solar panels, wind, and, green technology. This is clearly going to be the industries of the 21st century. Oil is the energy of the 20th century. Like it just could not be more obvious. And yet, not only is Trump's not trying to claim a piece of that, he's just ripped up all of Biden's climate programs, the green industry, the solar subsidies, the wind subsidies, and he's using like regulatory bullshit to try to shut down a bunch of offshore wind turbines, which he seems to have an almost pathological dislike of. Maybe because he could see him from his golf course in Scotland in 2006.
Right.
But so my question is, is there any perception of this in Venezuela that like, you're looking at a very probably time limited resource, especially stuff that's quite expensive to extract, the very viscous, very sulfur laden oil in Venezuela. Like that's going to be the stuff that stopped pumping first. It's going to be the Saudis. Or the last one standing. They'll be the last tank of gas filling up the last F-150 Super Duty, that's kind of out there, and the UAE or something like that. But are they looking at that?
Yes and no. I mean, I do think that actually, yes, Venezuela's oil has always been extra heavy crude, which essentially means all the things that you mentioned, but also that when it comes out of the ground, it's still not crude. It has to go through an initial refining process before you can even call it crude oil. And then it goes into the various refining. But actually that makes it more valuable because it can be turned into many different things, especially derivatives. And that might be part of the story here, right? Yes, of course, we've exited peak oil era. We're entering an era of greener energies. But if oil can be used for derivatives, plastics and other kinds of things, then that can, in some ways, the malleability of or the fungibility of Venezuelan crude might give it a little bit more purchase. But to your point about how it plays out in Venezuela, listen, I'm from Venezuela. I grew up in Venezuela. I was born and raised there. There isn't a single Venezuelan that believes in like recycling. That's not true. That's obviously, I'm sure there are people.
There might be one.
Let's just say that this is not it's like finding vegetarians in Argentina. They exist, but there's not many of them, right? And people look at them a little bit funny when they go to the Sunday asado, right? So, all of our entire sense of identity, whether you're in the opposition, in the extreme opposition, or whether you're in the left or the extreme left, is founded on the idea that the path to whatever we define prosperity as, whether it's socialist or capitalist or fascist or whatever, is oil. There are no alternatives. And so, to your point, there isn't even the beginning of a discussion of what an alternative might be. And yeah, that's of course a huge liability. And yes, Saudi oil tankers might be the last ones to be shipped, but I would suspect that in Venezuela, they'll put some in a tanker that will just float around the world with no port to dock in. So, that's what I would say to that.
Yeah.
So Professor, go ahead.
Oh, I just, I feel like it's such a cultural uphill battle, that we're working on in this country and in a lot of countries, Venezuela and the United States, so that like, the renewable revolution is not hippie bullshit. It's not about recycling and being a vegetarian. And I mean, it can be those things. It's sort of like tied to them in some ways. We're like, this is about money. This is about, this is about like the economic development and all that sort of stuff.
But that's a really, that's so central, because in some ways it highlights if we really think about the global geopolitical ramifications of what happened on Saturday, really what it manifests is a kind of, we talked about Midas, right? But exercise of politics through the sheer use of power alone, which of course is a return to, sphere of power understandings of global diplomacy. And if it is true, if that's the case, then really what you're saying is, okay, China has its sphere of influence and it's Asia. Russia has its sphere of influence, and the United States has its sphere of influence. In China, obviously, its sphere of influence, it is entirely based on a different future than the United States sphere of influence, at least in the terms of Trump's vision. And so in a way, it's sort of given carte blanche to places like China to, pardon the expression, press the gas, right, on exactly this kind of, new energy future, but remaking the entire image. I mean, Belt and Road is one thing, but now they've sort of like, they can impose this if they really wanted to, and maybe they will, right? And so it's sort of shocking, the short-sightedness of this national security strategy that is based on a kind of sphere of influence model of world politics, where the United States is explicitly placing itself in a disadvantageous position vis-a-vis the future.
It's a perfect setup for my last question, which is so broad that you could just do whatever you want with it. But because you've outlined a great diagnosis, we're trying to parse this kind of post-liberal new world order that Trump and his imperialists are trying to instantiate, this multipolar world. We've got, Putin with that sphere. We have all that might makes right, and so on and so forth. At the same time, we need to figure out a proper response that gives an alternative vision that seemingly isn't just the rules-based liberal internationalism that is seemingly crumbling, and as many leftists have pointed out, has been cover for much of U.S. empire and imperialism, and the things that in the past were done as subtext, under the cover of altruism, but now we've gotten rid of that. And so, what's your view, both in terms of the short term, because I think there could be clarity around like what would be a proper demand for righting the wrong that's just been done. Like some people say, we demand a return of Maduro and his wife, or we demand a lifting of sanctions. Like what are like immediate responses and demands that fit within a positive vision? And then more broadly, what's a kind of non-liberal response that doesn't simply recapitulate some of the failures of the past that can oppose this imperialist reactionary vision? So very big and broad, but just initial thoughts. Do what you want.
Who knows? I mean, on the first point, it's just been, I guess shocking. Is it shocking? I don't know. The response of Europe, the response of other parts of, Latin America to what happened, where
Macron gave the thumbs up initially, at least.
Yeah,
right?
Cowards. A little bit more sophistication. Of course, now they're like all backpedaling because of what he said about Greenland. Like, whoa, no. We didn't mean it that way.
Yeah.
We didn't mean we support you in that way. And so I think sort of in terms of your first question, one response, of course, from the dying embers of a liberal world order would be to reassert the fundamental principles of that international world order, which were sovereignty, respect for the rule of law. There is we cannot stress this enough, there is zero legal justification for what happened in Caracas on Saturday morning, right? You can't, a country can't unilaterally enact sanctions on another country and then declare all of its property subject to seizure. A country can't, unilaterally say that X person has committed a crime in our country, and then I'm going to go there and I'm going to extract you, whether you're the president or not, right? There's no Interpol international, warrant for Maduro. There's no WTO, ruling about, sanctioned ships or Venezuela's oil industry. These are all unilateral, right? And so the entire premise of the world order founded both after World War II and after the Cold War was premised on the idea of fundamental rules of the game that would bring countries together, not in a kumbaya way, but to follow and abide by basic rules. And, of course, we can talk about the pretext that required for imperialist projects under neocon administrations, George W. Bush, and others. But the complete collapse of even that pretext, and the way in which we've not heard from kind of stalwart liberal realms like Europe and elsewhere is really astonishing. And I can't tell if it's just fear that there'll be, that Trump will reimpose some, tariffs on them, or they just believe like, actually that thing is dead. And we just have to make peace with, or maybe not peace, with whatever's left. But, to your second question, like what could be done outside of that particular realm in terms of a response to this? there is a way in which this particular moment, I think, highlights the limits of the nation state, as it were, as a fundamental kind of way of thinking about the world. Part of the international world order was founded on the very premise of nations, right? And if sovereignty doesn't matter, then what are the new axes of sovereignty? And I wonder to what extent what, in a very hopeful reading, might be the rise of localities, right? I mean, it was, I'm here in New York, right? The election of Mamdani was it was the one shining moment in 2006 that I had. And then it was all shit after that. Because, he made this call to Trump saying, like, this was blatantly illegal. And of course, there's the local dimension insofar as Maduro and Silvia Flores are here in New York. But I also think that, I wonder to what extent, cities in particular or other, local sites can now become, or have a greater prominence in articulating one-to-one relationships if the very notion of sovereignty for nations is no longer the way to think about politics in the world.
Yeah, boy, New York is so, Netanyahu literally is someone who was in New York and who could have been arrested in New York because of the warrants out for him by the International Criminal Court and so forth. But then that was before Mamdani came in, who said that he would do that. But now that Mamdani's in, we're bringing Maduro, who,
That's right.
It's just a fascinating drama. But we've been all about the hope that Mamdani and his movements has represented. So I think there's a lot in that. What do you think, Ryan?
I've got a fair trade. I think we can, whatever we do to Nicolas Maduro, maybe that can be decided. See how this court thing plays out. But what we can do in compensation is that whenever we turf Trump out of office, we send him and Elon Musk over to Venezuela to do with as they will.
No, that's not fair. We don't deserve that. Come on.
It is unfair to Venezuela.
It's just a quick favor. You just don't want to see these guys again.
Talk about recycling. That's not that's our waste. That's
a revolving door.
Anyway, I think we've kept you long enough. That's a good place to wrap it up. Professor Alejandro Velasco, we will link to your bio and various
and the Guardian piece that's coming out. And by the time this comes out, it'll probably be out.
Yeah,
amazing.
And thanks for listening, everybody. We will see you in the next episode.